when my mother looked straight at me and said, "You're not half the woman your sister is." Something inside my chest tightened so suddenly it almost stole my breath. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They slid across the dinner table with the practiced ease of a sentence that had been rehearsed for years, polished by repetition, sharpened by comparison. For a split second, the familiar urge to shrink rose in me, the instinct to lower my eyes, to swallow whatever I was feeling and let the moment pass, like it always had. But this time, something was different. The room was warm with the smell of roasted chicken and rosemary. My parents' dining room always felt like a stage on Friday nights. The long wooden table polished until it reflected the overhead light, the chairs arranged with almost ceremonial precision. Family dinner wasn't a suggestion in our house. It was a rule, an unwritten law that no one dared to break. Every Friday, no matter how exhausting my week had been, no matter how badly I wanted to stay home in my small rented apartment in Portland and let the silence soothe me, I found myself driving out to the suburbs, rehearsing patience like a survival skill. That night had started like all the others. My father sat at the head of the table, relaxed, a glass of wine already half empty. My mother moved back and forth between the kitchen and her seat, adjusting napkins, straightening plates, making sure everything looked perfect. And beside me sat my sister, Claire, glowing in that effortless way she always had. Her posture was confident, her smile calm and assured, as if the room naturally bent itself around her presence. Conversation flowed, but not evenly. It never did. The talk revolved around Claire's new house, the one she had just bought closer to the city. My father spoke with unmistakable pride, describing the layout, the neighborhood, the way she had negotiated the final price. My mother nodded enthusiastically, chiming in about how tasteful Claire's choices were, how she had always had an eye for things that mattered. "She's always known what she wanted," my mother said, smiling at her, even as a child. Claire laughed lightly, brushing it off with practiced modesty, though I could see the satisfaction in her eyes. She deserved the praise. That was the unspoken truth everyone accepted. Claire had been the star for as long as I could remember, the one whose achievements were announced to relatives, whose milestones were celebrated loudly and publicly. I pushed food around my plate, chewing slowly, listening more than speaking. It wasn't that I had nothing to say. It was that I had learned, over time, that my words rarely altered the direction of the conversation. Silence had become my safest contribution. Then my mother set her fork down. The sound was soft, but it cut through the room more sharply than any raised voice could have. She looked at me directly, her gaze steady, her expression composed in that familiar blend of authority and disappointment. "You know," she said, "you really should take a page from your sister's book. You're not half the woman she is." The sentence landed between us like a verdict. My heart clenched. Not because the words were new, but because they weren't. They echoed every comparison I had heard growing up, every subtle reminder that no matter how hard I worked, no matter how responsible or reliable I was, I would always come second in their eyes. I felt the familiar burn behind my eyes, the heat of emotion I had spent years learning to control. But instead of lowering my head, I pushed my chair back. The scrape of wood against the floor was loud in the sudden silence, sending a ripple of unease through the room. My mother's eyebrows lifted slightly, surprised. Claire's smile faltered, just for a moment. My father paused mid-sip, the glass hovering near his lips. I stood up, my hands steady even though my heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. "Then let her pay the rent for you," I said calmly. The words didn't come out sharp or angry. They were even, measured, delivered with a composure that surprised even me. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Claire blinked, clearly confused. My mother stared at me as if I had spoken in a language she didn't understand. My father's face drained of color, the warmth of the evening evaporating as he slowly set his glass down. "Rent?" he asked, his voice thin, uncertain. "What rent?" I remained standing, my gaze moving from my mother to my father, then briefly to Claire, who was now very still, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I mean the mortgage," I said, The one on this house? The silence deepened, heavy and suffocating. Somewhere outside, a car passed by, its headlights briefly flashing through the window, a reminder that the world beyond this dining room still existed. For the past 3 years, I continued, my voice steady despite the storm gathering inside me. I've been sending money every month to help you cover it. My mother shook her head immediately, as if rejecting the idea could erase it. That's not true, she said, her tone sharp with denial. We never asked you to do that. My father straightened in his chair, crossing his arms in a reflexive attempt to reclaim control. This is not the time for this. Maddie, he said, if you chose to help, that was your decision. Don't turn family dinner into a list of your contributions. I felt a bitter laugh rise in my chest, but I swallowed it down. For years, I had carried this quietly. For years, I had sat at this same table, listening to praise directed elsewhere while my own sacrifices went unnamed, unnoticed, unacknowledged. I had told myself it was fine, that family didn't keep score, that doing the right thing didn't require applause. But standing there, hearing my mother tell me I wasn't even half of my sister, something inside me finally broke open. I didn't bring it up, I said quietly. You did. The words hung in the air, unanswered. In that moment, I saw it with painful clarity. This wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about being seen, about being recognized as more than just a reliable presence in the background, more than a quiet daughter whose worth was measured only in comparison to someone else's shine. My hands trembled slightly at my sides, but I didn't sit back down. I realized then that whatever happened next, whatever fallout followed, there was no going back to the way things had been. The silence I had relied on for so long had finally betrayed me, and the truth I had kept buried was already pushing its way to the surface. If it were you, could you have endured years of being measured and found lacking, even as you held everything together behind the scenes? And where are you listening to this story from right now? Let me know, because I truly want to see how far this moment travels. That night, at that table, with my parents staring at me in disbelief, and my sister suddenly unsure of her place, the story I had lived quietly for years began to unravel. And this time, I wasn't going to stop it. My name is Malene Harris, though almost everyone calls me Maddie. I am 28 years old, and on paper, my life looks calm, orderly, even enviable in small ways. I live in a tidy one-bedroom apartment in Portland, Oregon, not far from the river, in a building that smells faintly of laundry detergent and old wood. I work as a financial manager for a logistics company near the harbor, a job that pays steadily and demands precision, focus, and long hours. I have a handful of close friends, the kind who don't require constant attention, who understand silence as well as conversation. From the outside, there is nothing obviously broken about my life, but appearances can be deceiving. Every Friday night, without fail, that sense of stability cracks just enough to remind me that I am still tethered to a place where I am not measured by who I am, but by who I am not. My parents' house sits in a quiet suburb, a two-story structure with pale siding and a front porch that creaks slightly when you step on the third plank from the left. It is the house I grew up in, the one that holds the echo of my childhood footsteps and the memories of countless dinners that followed the same script. For my parents, Friday night dinner is not a tradition. It is an obligation. No one is allowed to miss it. No excuses are accepted without resistance. Over the years, I have tried everything. I have claimed deadlines at work, headaches, exhaustion so deep it felt like it lived in my bones. None of it mattered. If I hesitated, my mother would call again and again, her voice growing sharper with each unanswered ring. If I still resisted, my father would step in with a half-joking tone that carried an unmistakable warning beneath it. "This family has a seat for you," he would say. "Don't leave it empty." So I went. Every time, week after week. I drove the familiar route out of the city, past the dimming streetlights and quiet lawns, rehearsing patience as if it were a necessary skill for survival. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I would already feel smaller, as though some invisible weight had settled onto my shoulders. Inside that house, time seemed to move differently. The dining room had not changed in years. The same long wooden table, the same framed photos on the walls, most of them featuring Claire at various stages of her life. Claire holding a debate trophy, Claire in her graduation gown, Claire smiling in front of impressive buildings I recognized from brochures and websites. There were pictures of me too, scattered among them, but they felt quieter somehow, less intentional. I had learned early on where I fit in this arrangement. Claire is 3 years older than me, and from the moment she learned how to speak clearly and stand confidently, she was marked as exceptional. She was tall, articulate, and fearless in ways I never was. In high school, she captained the debate team, her voice strong and persuasive, her arguments sharp and confident. Later, she earned a full scholarship to study law at the University of Washington, a fact my parents repeated to relatives with glowing pride, as if her success validated every choice they had ever made. She was born to succeed, my mother often said. I believed her. Growing up beside Claire felt like living next to a spotlight that never dimmed. Wherever she went, attention followed. Compliments came easily to her, applause naturally. I, on the other hand, preferred quieter victories. I liked numbers. I liked systems that made sense, problems that could be solved with patience rather than performance. While Claire thrived on recognition, I thrived on structure and reliability. That difference shaped everything. At family gatherings, relatives gathered around Claire, eager to hear her stories, to marvel at her confidence. I usually ended up at the edge of the room, helping in the kitchen or sitting quietly with a plate balanced on my knees. When someone did notice me, the comment was almost always the same. Maddie is so quiet. They would say, very sensitive. It was never meant as an insult, but it settled on me like a label I couldn't peel off. Even in school, the pattern repeated. My grades were consistently high, especially in math. I brought home papers marked with bright red A's, proud of the work I had done. But when my parents talked about us to others, it was Claire's achievements that took center stage. Claire's competitions, Claire's awards, Claire's future. I stood behind them, holding my accomplishments like fragile things no one had asked to see. Over time, I stopped offering them. I learned to be useful instead, responsible, dependable. When I was 17, I took my first part-time job, determined to pay my own way through college. I worked evenings and weekends, balancing classes with long shifts, telling myself it was a form of independence. I didn't ask my parents for tuition money. I didn't complain. I handled it, and I thought that would be enough. As the years passed, I built a life defined by self-reliance. I graduated. I found steady work. I rented my own place. I managed my finances carefully, saving whenever I could, dreaming quietly of buying my own apartment someday. I believed that if I kept my head down and did everything right, eventually my efforts would speak for themselves. But Friday nights never changed. At that table, conversation always drifted back to Claire, her career at the law firm, her promotions, her plans. My father spoke of her with admiration that bordered on reverence. My mother echoed him, nodding eagerly, reinforcing the narrative they had crafted over decades. She deserves it, my father would say. She's worked so hard. I would sit there, nodding along, chewing slowly, feeling a familiar bitterness settle in my chest. Not because Claire didn't deserve her success, but because my own efforts were invisible by comparison. In their eyes, I was stable, yes, but unremarkable, reliable, but replaceable. No one mentioned that I had worked my way through school. No one acknowledged that I had built a solid career without assistance. And no one, at that table, ever spoke of the times I had quietly stepped in when the family needed help. Those contributions remained unnamed, filed away under expectation rather than gratitude. By the time my mother delivered her cutting comparison that Friday night, I realized something with startling clarity. This wasn't a single moment of cruelty. It was the culmination of years of being measured, found lacking, and quietly expected to accept it. And for the first time, I understood that the story I had been living inside this family was never going to change unless I disrupted it myself. What I didn't yet realize was how deeply that story was about to unravel, or how much truth had been waiting, heavy and dangerous, beneath my silence. If Claire was the light in our family, then I had grown up learning how to exist in the shade it cast. She was only 3 years older than me. But in our house, that difference might as well have been a lifetime. From as far back as I can remember, Claire had a presence that filled every room she entered. She spoke early, spoke clearly, and spoke with a confidence that made adults listen. When she laughed, people turned toward the sound. When she told a story, everyone leaned in. I watched all of it quietly, absorbing the lesson without ever being taught directly. Claire was meant to be seen. I was meant to adapt. When we were children, relatives visited often. Holidays, birthdays, random Sunday afternoons when someone dropped by unannounced. The living room would fill with voices and clinking cups, and Claire would somehow always end up in the center of it all. She would perform little skits she made up on the spot, recite poems she had memorized, tell jokes she'd overheard from older kids and perfected through repetition. People clapped, people laughed. People said things like, "She's going to be something special one day." I usually sat at the smaller table near the kitchen, legs swinging beneath my chair, a pencil in my hand. I liked drawing patterns, counting tiles on the floor, arranging objects into neat rows. Once, when I was about 8, I spent an entire afternoon building an intricate structure out of Lego blocks, carefully following the diagrams, correcting mistakes when something didn't line up. My mother glanced at it briefly before calling out to the living room. "Claire, come show Aunt Linda that dance you learned." I remember standing there, my Lego creation finished, unsure what to do with it. No one had asked to see it. Eventually, I took it apart piece by piece, the quiet, dismantling feeling strangely familiar even then. As we grew older, the gap widened. In school, Claire gravitated toward activities that put her front and center: debate club, student council, anything that required a voice and an audience. She thrived in it. Teachers praised her articulation. Coaches admired her confidence. My parents attended every event, sitting in the front row, cameras ready. I went to different rooms entirely. I loved math because it was honest. There were rules. There were answers. You either understood the logic or you didn't. And improvement came from effort, not charm. I spent afternoons solving problems that made my head ache in a satisfying way. When test results came back, my scores were consistently near the top. I brought those papers home, folding them carefully, hoping for something. My parents glanced at them, nodded, and moved on. Later that evening, the phone would ring, and I would hear my mother's voice float through the house. "Yes, Claire made the debate team again. She's really something." I stood in the hallway, clutching my A-plus paper, feeling like I had brought the wrong currency into the room. Over time, I stopped expecting acknowledgement. I told myself that being quiet was simply who I was, that sensitivity was a strength, not a weakness. But somewhere deep inside, a small part of me wondered what it would feel like to be celebrated instead of tolerated. That question followed me into adulthood. Claire's success unfolded exactly as everyone predicted. She received a full scholarship to study law, and my parents spoke of it as if it were a personal victory. They told anyone who would listen how proud they were, how their daughter was destined for great things. When she graduated, there was a party. When she landed her first job at a prestigious firm, there were toasts and photos and long speeches about perseverance and talent. I attended every celebration, smiling politely, applauding on cue. Meanwhile, my own path was quieter, less dramatic, but no less demanding. I worked my way through college, juggling part-time jobs with full course loads. I learned early how to budget, how to plan, how to survive without safety nets. I built a career in finance because it suited me. I liked understanding how systems worked, how decisions made today rippled into consequences tomorrow. I didn't announce my milestones. I didn't expect applause. What I hadn't anticipated was how invisible I would remain, even as I carried more than anyone realized. At family dinners, the pattern persisted. Conversation orbited Claire's life, her choices, her future. My father spoke of her with a pride that softened his features. My mother listened with shining eyes, nodding, adding details, reinforcing the image of the daughter who embodied success. I sat there, present but peripheral. Sometimes, my mother would glance at me and say, "Maddie is doing fine too. She's very independent." The words sounded like an afterthought, an obligation fulfilled. Fine. Independent. Sensitive. Those labels followed me like shadows. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need validation, that my worth wasn't tied to how loudly it was acknowledged. I believed that for a long time, or at least, I convinced myself I did. But then there were moments when the truth slipped through the cracks. Like the night I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen, voices low but intense. My father sounded worried. My mother sounded tired. I didn't know yet what they were discussing, only that the tone was different from usual. Strained, fearful. I stood in the hallway, listening, my heart beating faster. When my mother's voice broke, I felt an instinctive pull to step in, to help, to fix whatever was wrong. That instinct had always been there. To be useful, to be the one who held things together quietly. I didn't yet realize how deeply that instinct would cost me. Looking back, I can see now that the roles had been assigned long before I ever agreed to them. Claire was the symbol of success, the one whose achievements could be displayed proudly. I was the support beam, hidden behind the walls, unnoticed unless it failed. And like any structure built on unspoken expectations, the weight kept increasing. By the time I sat at that dinner table years later, listening to my mother tell me I wasn't half the woman my sister was, the truth was already there, heavy and dangerous, pressing against the silence I had maintained for far too long. I had spent my life learning how to stand in someone else's shadow. What I hadn't learned yet was what it would take to step out of it. 3 years earlier, on a winter night so cold it seemed to seep through the walls of my apartment, my phone began to vibrate on the table beside me. I remember the exact moment because it was rare for my mother to call that late. It was past 10, the hour when her world usually quieted down, when she retreated into routine and sleep. Seeing her name light up the screen sent a small jolt through my body, a warning before the sound even reached my ears. I let it ring twice before answering, already bracing myself. "Maddie," she said, and the tremor in her voice told me everything before the words did. She sounded thinner somehow, as if fear had hollowed her out. "We have a problem." I sat down slowly, my eyes drifting to the window where rain streaked down the glass in uneven lines. Portland winters are like that, damp and gray, a constant reminder of things pressing in. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear. "What's wrong?" I asked. She inhaled sharply, then let the breath out in a rush. "Your father lost a major contract. The biggest one he had. We don't have enough to cover the mortgage this month." The word mortgage landed hard in my chest. It wasn't abstract. It was the house. The walls I grew up within, the stairs I ran up as a child, the kitchen table where I learned, over years, how to be quiet. "If the bank doesn't receive the payment," she continued, her voice cracking, "they'll send a notice next week. Maddie, we could lose the house." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I stared at the stacks of papers on my desk, spreadsheets from work, numbers neatly aligned and obedient, and felt a coldness crawl up my spine. Numbers were supposed to be neutral, manageable, but this one carried weight. History, memory. My mother's breathing grew uneven on the other end of the line. "I wouldn't ask if there was another way," she said quickly, as if anticipating resistance. "I know this is sudden. I know you have your own life, but can you help us just this once? Just until things stabilize. Your father will find another contract. We'll pay you back, just this once." I closed my eyes. At that time, I had been working steadily for a few years, saving carefully, quietly building toward a goal I hadn't told anyone about yet. I wanted to buy my own apartment, not something grand, just a place that belonged to me. I had been telling myself 2, maybe 3 more years. And it could happen. I thought of that dream as my mother waited on the line, her silence thick with desperation. "Yes," I said finally. "I'll transfer it tomorrow morning." Her relief was immediate, almost overwhelming. She thanked me again and again, her voice trembling with gratitude. "This means everything," she said. "Just this once, I promise." When the call ended, the apartment felt unusually quiet. I sat there for a long time, staring at the dark screen of my phone, my chest heavy with the decision I had just made. I told myself it was temporary, that families help each other in emergencies, that I was doing the right thing. The next morning, I logged into my bank account and made the transfer. It was a significant amount, enough to make my stomach tighten as I typed in the numbers. But I reminded myself that savings could be rebuilt. A home, once lost, couldn't be so easily recovered. My mother called later that day, her voice lighter than it had been in weeks. "You saved us," she said. "I don't know what we would have done without you." I believed that would be the end of it. The following month, another message arrived. This time, it was a text, short and apologetic. "Sweetheart, things still haven't recovered. Can you help just this month? We're almost there." I hesitated longer that time, but the memory of my mother's fear was still fresh. I transferred the money again. Then came the next month, and the one after that. Each time, the words were nearly identical. "Just this once. Almost there. Next month will be different." And each time, I agreed, telling myself I could absorb the hit a little longer. I stopped setting aside money for my own future and began to think of my savings as a buffer for the family, a silent safety net no one else seemed willing or able to provide. Eventually, the transfers became routine. I set up automatic payments through the bank, scheduling them for the 15th of each month. It was easier that way. I told myself, less emotional, more efficient. The money would leave my account quietly, without forcing me to confront the choice every single time. But I noticed the impact immediately. My savings shrank. Plans shifted. I said no to a weekend trip with friends because I needed to be careful. I postponed applying for graduate programs because the numbers no longer lined up the way they once had. When my landlord raised the rent and offered me a larger unit if I could cover the deposit, I declined, telling myself it wasn't the right time. Every sacrifice traced back to one place. That house, once. While working late at the office, my father called. His voice sounded older than I remembered, stripped of its usual confidence. "Maddie," he said quietly, "I hate having to ask, but this month is especially hard. If we miss this payment, your mother won't be able to handle it." I stared out at the rain-slicked streets below my office window, anger and pity twisting together inside me. I wanted to ask why Claire couldn't help. I wanted to ask why the burden always fell on me, but I didn't. I nodded, even though he couldn't see it, and said yes again. By the time 3 years had passed, the pattern was set. 36 transfers, over $70,000 gone, quietly, steadily, month by month. And yet, at family dinners, nothing changed. The house stood. The lights stayed on. The table was still full on Friday nights. But my role remained the same, unspoken and unacknowledged. The help I provided was treated not as a sacrifice, but as an expectation, a natural extension of who I was supposed to be. Sitting at that dinner table years later, listening to my mother say I wasn't half the woman my sister was, I felt the full weight of those nights, those decisions, crash over me all at once. The winter call, the promises, the years of quiet compliance, and for the first time, I understood something with painful clarity. Just this once had never been just once. It had been the beginning of everything. At first, I told myself there was a rhythm to it, something almost manageable. 1 transfer didn't feel like surrender. 2 felt inconvenient but understandable. By the 3rd month, I had already started rearranging my budget in my head, trimming small comforts, convincing myself that this was temporary, that families lean on each other during rough seasons and then find their balance again. But seasons have a way of stretching when no one is forced to change. The automatic payment was my idea. I remember sitting at my small dining table late one night, laptop open, bank website glowing softly in the dark. I had just finished another long day at work, my eyes tired from spreadsheets and forecasts, and I didn't want to have to relive the same emotional negotiation every month. Setting it up felt efficient, responsible, a clean solution. The money would move quietly, without drama. without the need for another phone call full of promises and guilt. Once it was scheduled, the transfers stopped feeling like decisions and started feeling like gravity. Every month, on the 15th, the alert would appear on my phone. Payment sent, same amount, same destination. At first, I barely noticed it. Then I started checking my balance more often. Then I started calculating what I could and couldn't afford with a precision that bordered on obsession. In finance, there's a concept called opportunity cost. It's the value of what you give up when you choose one option over another. At work, I explained it to clients all the time. Every dollar tied up in one place is a dollar you can't use elsewhere. Every decision has a shadow price. Living it felt very different from teaching it. The money I sent my parents wasn't just leaving my account. It was quietly erasing other possibilities. It was the down payment that didn't happen. The emergency fund that stayed thinner than it should have been. The flexibility I lost without ever announcing it. Friends would invite me on trips, and I would hesitate before declining, telling them work was busy. I skipped dinners out more often, cooked at home, convinced myself that simplicity was a virtue rather than a necessity. When coworkers talked about buying property, I smiled politely and changed the subject, my chest tightening with a mix of envy and self-reproach. I didn't tell anyone why. There was a strange kind of shame in it, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. Part of me worried that if I said it out loud, it would sound foolish. Another part feared the questions that would follow. Why you? Why not your sister? Why does this keep happening? Questions I didn't yet have the courage to answer myself. My parents never discussed the arrangement openly. It existed in a private channel of texts and occasional calls, always framed as temporary, always cushioned with reassurance. Things are improving, my mother would say. We're almost back on our feet. Or, your father has a promising lead. Just one more month. Each time, I wanted to believe them. I needed to believe them, because admitting the truth would have meant acknowledging that I had stepped into a role no one intended to release me from. Gradually, the tone of their messages shifted. Gratitude softened into expectation. Relief turned into assumption. The thank yous became less frequent, replaced by updates that sounded more like reports than requests. Mortgage is due next week. The bank statement came in. The unspoken understanding was clear. I would handle it. I noticed something else too. Claire's life continued to move forward without interruption. She bought her house. She talked about renovations, furniture, future plans. At dinner, my parents spoke proudly about her independence, her success, her ability to build something tangible. No one mentioned that the house we were sitting in was still standing because of money I quietly sent every month. The imbalance settled into my body in subtle ways. I slept less deeply. I carried a low-grade tension with me, a constant awareness of numbers ticking down. At work, I was sharp and focused, but when I came home, exhaustion hit me like a wave. I would sit on the couch, staring at the ceiling, wondering how something that started as an act of care had turned into a quiet drain on my sense of self. There were moments when resentment flickered, brief and unwelcome. I pushed it away quickly, ashamed of it. Resentment felt like a betrayal of my own values. I told myself I was being selfish for even thinking it. Family comes first, I repeated. I'll rebuild later. But later kept moving further away. One evening, after another transfer cleared, I opened my budgeting spreadsheet and stared at the numbers longer than usual. The projection line that once sloped upward had flattened. In some months, it dipped. I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with finances and everything to do with realization. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about identity. Somewhere along the way, I had become the family's quiet solution, the invisible stabilizer, the one who absorbed risk so others didn't have to feel it, the one whose sacrifice was so consistent it stopped being remarkable. I hadn't agreed to that role out loud. I had simply grown into it, guided by habit, guilt, and a lifetime of learning that my value lay in being useful rather than visible. By the end of the third year, the automatic payment felt less like help and more like a chain I wore without ever touching. It bound me to a version of myself defined by obligation rather than choice. Sitting at that dinner table, hearing my mother's comparison, Something inside me finally connected the dots. The bitterness I swallowed, the plans I postponed, the opportunities I let pass quietly by. All of it traced back to those monthly transfers, to the moment when helping became expected and expectation became entitlement. And deep down, a question I had avoided for years began to surface, demanding an answer. If I kept going like this, at what point would I finally disappear from my own life? By the third year, the transfers had lost all sense of urgency. They no longer arrived wrapped in panic or followed by frantic calls filled with gratitude. They came and went quietly, like a background process running on a computer you rarely think about until it drains the system. 36 payments. That was the number I would later count. But back then, I didn't think of them as individual sacrifices. I thought of them as continuity, stability, the cost of keeping everything from falling apart. Each month, on the 15th, the money left my account, and life went on as if nothing had happened. And in a way, nothing did. The house stayed exactly the same pale siding, the same creaking porch, the same dining room table where my mother served her carefully prepared meals. The roof didn't collapse. The bank didn't knock on the door. From the outside, there was no visible sign that the house had ever been in danger, which meant there was no visible sign of me. At family dinners, no one mentioned the mortgage. No one acknowledged that the house we sat in was being held together by my paycheck. My role remained unchanged. I was still the quiet daughter, the one who listened more than she spoke, the one who always showed up. Sometimes, my mother would glance at me and say, "You've always been responsible, Maddie." The words sounded like praise, but they felt strangely hollow. Responsibility, in our family, wasn't something to be thanked. It was something to be relied upon. My father rarely spoke about finances with me directly anymore. When he did, his tone was casual, almost detached, as if the arrangement were an established fact rather than a favor I had extended. The bank statement came. He would say, "Everything's covered, covered," as if by an invisible hand. Claire, for her part, remained blissfully unaware, or at least convincingly so. She talked about her house renovations, her career milestones, her plans for the future. At dinner, she laughed easily, accepted compliments gracefully, and never once looked in my direction when finances were discussed in passing. I watched her, searching for any sign that she knew, that she suspected, that she might step in. She never did. And perhaps that was the hardest part. It wasn't just that my parents failed to acknowledge what I was doing. It was that no one even thought to ask whether I was okay. No one wondered what I had given up to make this possible. The silence around my sacrifice grew so thick it began to feel intentional. In moments of honesty, I admitted to myself that part of me wanted recognition, not applause, not a banner, just a simple acknowledgement that what I was doing mattered, that it wasn't invisible. But wanting that felt childish. So I buried the desire alongside my resentment and carried on. I told myself I was stronger than this, more mature. That needing to be seen was a weakness I should outgrow. The longer it went on, the more my sense of self began to warp around the arrangement. I stopped thinking of my money as truly mine. I stopped imagining a future that didn't include this obligation. My life began to feel like a holding pattern, a waiting room where nothing really began, because something else always needed to be sustained first. There were nights when I lay awake in my apartment, listening to the hum of the city outside, and felt a strange emptiness settle in my chest. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was more like erosion, a slow wearing away of something essential. I thought about the version of myself I had been at 22, full of plans and quiet ambition. I wondered when she had been replaced by someone who measured her worth by how much she could give without complaint. At work, I was respected. My opinions mattered. My analyses were valued. I received compliments from supervisors who had no reason to flatter me. In that environment, I felt solid, capable, seen. At home, I felt like an afterthought. The contrast was jarring. It made me question which version of me was real. Then came the dinner that changed everything. By the time the wine glasses were nearly empty and my mother set her fork down, I was already tired in a way that had nothing to do with work or long weeks. I was tired of being unacknowledged, tired of shrinking, tired of carrying a weight no one else seemed to feel. When she looked at me and said I wasn't even half the woman my sister was, something inside me snapped into focus. The words didn't just hurt, they clarified. In that moment, I saw the full picture. The years of comparison, the silent transfers, the invisible labor, the way my sacrifice had been folded into the background until it was no longer even worth mentioning. I realized then that my silence had taught them how to treat me, and for the first time, I understood that if I didn't speak, if I didn't disrupt the story they had grown comfortable telling, I would remain exactly where I was, unseen, uncredited, expected to give without limit. As I pushed my chair back and spoke the words that froze the room, I wasn't just revealing a financial truth. I was breaking a pattern that had defined my entire life. The moment the words left my mouth, the room felt as though it had been sealed off from the rest of the world. Sound dulled, movement slowed. Even the clink of silverware from a neighboring house, usually faint but present through the thin suburban walls, seemed to vanish. "I've been paying the mortgage," I said again, more clearly this time. "Every month. For 3 years." My mother's face tightened, lines appearing around her mouth as if she were bracing against something unpleasant. She shook her head, quick and decisive, as though rejecting the idea alone could make it untrue. "We never asked you to do that," she said. "If you chose to help, that was your decision. Don't twist it now." The words hit me harder than the comparison had. Twist it? I felt something sharp rise in my chest, a mix of disbelief and anger. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined everything. The calls, the texts, the promises, the carefully worded pleas that had come wrapped in fear and urgency. Gaslighting has a way of doing that, of making reality feel slippery, unreliable. My father cleared his throat and leaned back in his chair, folding his arms in a posture I recognized well. Authority, finality. The stance he took whenever he wanted to shut a conversation down. "Maddie," he said, his voice firm, "this is not appropriate. Family dinners are not the place to keep score." I laughed then, a short, hollow sound that surprised even me. "Keeping score," I repeated. "You think this is about keeping score?" Claire shifted beside me, her hands clasped tightly together. She stared at the table, at the wood grain, at anything but my face. For the first time that evening, she looked uncomfortable, stripped of her usual composure. "I didn't bring this up to humiliate anyone," I continued. "I brought it up because I just sat here and listened to Mom tell me I'm not even half of you. And I realized I couldn't do that anymore." My mother's expression softened, but only slightly, and not in the way I had hoped. It was the look she reserved for moments when she believed I was being unreasonable, when she saw me not as hurt, but as overly emotional. "You've always been sensitive," she said gently. "We never said you weren't important. Claire's achievements are just more visible. You have to understand that. More visible." The phrase landed like a quiet dismissal. I stared at her, searching her face for any trace of recognition, any sign that she understood what I was trying to say. I saw none, only a polite kind of concern. The kind you offer someone who is making things uncomfortable, rather than someone who has been wronged. "Visible," I repeated slowly. "So the work that doesn't show doesn't count." No one answered. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until it felt like it was pressing against my ears. My father avoided my gaze, focusing instead on the half-empty bottle of wine. Claire remained silent, her shoulders drawn in, as if she were trying to make herself smaller. I felt a familiar urge rise up then, the instinct to apologize, to smooth things over, to take responsibility for the discomfort I had caused by speaking at all. It was a reflex born of years of practice. But something stopped me. I thought of every late night I had sat alone in my apartment, staring at my bank balance. Every plan I had postponed. Every dream I had quietly folded away because someone else's crisis always came first. And I realized how deeply unfair it was that even now, I was being asked to carry the emotional burden of this moment. "I worked since I was 17 to pay for my own education," I said quietly. "I built my career on my own. I kept this house from being foreclosed. And tonight, I'm told I'm not even half of my sister. My voice wavered slightly, but I didn't stop. Do you have any idea what that feels like? My mother sighed, a sound heavy with fatigue. We never meant to hurt you. Intent. I had learned. Doesn't erase impact. Not meaning to hurt someone doesn't make the hurt disappear. I replied. Claire finally looked up then. Our eyes met briefly, and in hers, I saw something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not indifference, but confusion, discomfort, perhaps even guilt. But she didn't speak. She never did. And that silence spoke volumes. In that moment, a memory surfaced with startling clarity. A family gathering years ago. Relatives packed into the living room. Claire in the center, animated and laughing. Me, standing by the doorway, holding a tray of drinks, listening as someone said, Claire is really something special. I had waited then, just a beat too long, hoping someone would add, and Maddie is too. No one had. The realization settled over me now, heavy and unmistakable. I had been waiting for acknowledgement from people who didn't know how to give it. I had been investing emotionally in a system that thrived on my silence. I straightened my back, feeling something solid form inside me for the first time that evening. This isn't about money, I said. It never was. It's about being seen, and I finally understand that no matter what I do, you're not going to see me. My father's jaw tightened. If you walk out on this family, he said sharply, don't expect to come back. The words were meant to frighten me, to pull me back into line. For years, they would have worked. Instead, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. I'm not walking out, I said. I'm stepping away. There's a difference, I realized then, between abandoning something and choosing yourself. The dinner ended not with shouting, but with a silence so heavy it felt like mourning. I grabbed my coat, my movements deliberate, unhurried. No one tried to stop me. No one followed. As I drove back toward the city, the streetlights blurred past my windshield, each one marking distance, not just in miles, but in meaning. I replayed the evening over and over, the denial, the dismissal, the quiet refusal to acknowledge what I had given. And for the first time in years, I asked myself a question I had never dared to voice. What if I stopped trying to earn a place that was never meant to be mine? The thought scared me, but it also felt like the first honest thing I had thought in a very long time. That night, the drive back to my apartment felt longer than usual, even though the roads were clear and the traffic lights seemed to turn in my favor. I barely noticed the route I had driven hundreds of times before. My hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, but my thoughts were tangled, looping back to the same moments again and again. My mother's calm dismissal, my father's warning, Claire's silence, the way the truth had been laid bare only to be brushed aside, as if it were inconvenient rather than undeniable. When I finally parked outside my building, the engine idled longer than necessary. I sat there, staring at the darkened windows above, trying to steady my breathing. The night air pressed in when I opened the door, cold and sharp, cutting through the fog in my head just enough to remind me that I was alone now in a different way than before. Inside, the apartment greeted me with a heavy quiet. I turned on the lights one by one, their warm glow revealing the same familiar scene. The small dining table by the window, the couch with its slightly worn cushions, the bookshelf I had filled carefully over the years. Everything was exactly as I had left it that morning, yet it felt altered, as though the space itself had absorbed the tension I carried back with me. I dropped my bag near the door and sat at the table, resting my elbows on the cool surface. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with the aftermath of something finally released. For 3 years, I had lived in a constant state of restraint, managing not only my finances but my emotions, my expectations, my voice. And now that restraint had cracked. Without fully deciding to, I opened my laptop. The familiar glow of the screen filled the room as I logged into my bank account. I knew exactly where to go. I had navigated this interface countless times before, often with a detached professionalism that kept feelings at bay. But tonight, every click felt weighted, deliberate, scheduled transfers. There it was, laid out in simple, impersonal lines. The same payment, set to leave my account on the 15th of every month. The same destination, the same quiet certainty that this obligation would continue unless I stopped it. I stared at it for a long moment, my chest tightening. Canceling it felt like betrayal, not of my parents, but of the version of myself who had believed so strongly in carrying the family through hardship. That version of me had acted out of care, loyalty, and a deep sense of responsibility. Letting go felt like erasing her effort. But then, another thought surfaced, steady and insistent. If I don't stop this now, nothing will ever change. I clicked cancel. A confirmation window appeared. Its language neutral and unemotional. Are you sure you want to stop this automatic payment? I inhaled slowly, then pressed yes. The screen refreshed. The scheduled transfer disappeared. For a second, I just stared, waiting for something dramatic to happen. An alarm, a rush of relief, a wave of panic. Instead, what I felt was a sharp, aching emptiness, like something essential had been cut away. I closed the laptop, pushed my chair back, and stood, pacing the length of the apartment as if movement alone could help me process what I had just done. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water, my hand still shaking slightly. I drank it in small sips, leaning against the counter, grounding myself in the sensation of the cold glass beneath my fingers. When I returned to the table, my gaze fell on the drawer beneath it. I opened it and pulled out the folder I had kept hidden there for years. Inside were printed bank statements, neatly arranged, each page marked with dates and amounts. I had started keeping them after the first few transfers, telling myself it was practical, a way to stay organized. Over time, the stack had grown thicker, heavier, proof, quietly accumulating. I spread the papers across the table, the black and white sheets overlapping, covering nearly every inch of the surface. The numbers stared back at me, cold and undeniable. 500, 1,000, 1,500, some months more than others, depending on what my parents said they needed. I picked up a pen and began adding them up, my movements slow, methodical. This was familiar territory. Numbers had always made sense to me when emotions didn't. When I reached the final total, my breath caught. Over $70,000. The figure sat there on the page, stark and unyielding. For a moment, I couldn't look away. That number wasn't abstract. It represented 3 years of choices, compromises, and quiet sacrifices. It was the down payment I had planned for my own apartment, the safety net I never fully rebuilt, the opportunities I had deferred without ever naming them as losses. My chest tightened, and my eyes burned. I remembered the times I had turned down invitations, telling friends I was too busy when the truth was I couldn't afford the extra expense. The graduate programs I had bookmarked but never applied to because my savings didn't feel secure enough. The larger apartment I passed on because the deposit would have stretched me too thin. Every decision traced back to these pages. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, letting the weight of it settle. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the anger I had suppressed, not explosive rage, but a deep, steady indignation. I had given so much, and yet, in my family's narrative, none of it existed. And then, beneath the anger, something unexpected began to surface. Relief. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew as I sat there, surrounded by evidence of what I had endured. For the first time in 3 years, there would be no automatic deduction, no quiet withdrawal that I pretended not to notice, no invisible obligation draining my future before it had a chance to form. I stood up and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the dark, the river reflecting them in broken patterns. Portland stretched out before me, alive and indifferent, a reminder that life continued beyond the narrow confines of my family's expectations. That money should have been the down payment for my own home, I whispered, the words startling in the stillness. Saying it out loud felt dangerous and liberating. I returned to the table and left the papers where they were. I didn't stack them away or tuck them back into the drawer. I wanted to see them, to remember both what they represented and what they no longer controlled. That night, I didn't turn on the television or distract myself with music. I sat with the silence, letting it wash over me. It wasn't the suffocating silence of the dinner table. It was different, spacious, uncertain, full of possibility. When I finally lay down in bed, exhaustion pulled me under quickly. But just before sleep claimed me, one thought settled into place with surprising clarity. Tomorrow would be different. Not because my family had changed, not because they had finally seen me, but because I had. The morning after I canceled the transfer, I woke before my alarm went off. For a moment, I lay still, listening to the muted sounds of the city waking up outside my window. A distant siren, the low hum of traffic, the quiet thud of footsteps from the apartment above mine. Everything sounded the same, yet something inside me had shifted. There was no urgent message from my mother, no missed calls, no texts filled with anxiety or expectation. The absence of those signals felt strange, almost unsettling, like stepping into a room and realizing the noise you'd grown accustomed to was suddenly gone. I got out of bed and pulled on my running shoes. Running had never been a habit for me before. It was something I had always meant to try, something I told myself I would do when life slowed down. But that morning, the urge came naturally, as if my body needed movement to process what my mind had already begun to accept. Outside, the air was crisp and cool. A thin mist hovered over the Willamette River, softening the outlines of the trees along the path. I started slow, my breath shallow at first, my legs stiff from disuse. With each step, I felt a faint burn in my muscles, a reminder that I was asking something new of myself. I ran without a destination, without a pace to maintain. I ran until my lungs expanded fully, until the tightness in my chest loosened, until my thoughts began to quiet. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't running toward anything or away from anyone. I was running for myself. When I returned home, flushed and breathless, I felt a small, unfamiliar sense of accomplishment. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't change my life, but it was mine. That feeling stayed with me as the days passed. Without the monthly transfer hanging over my finances, my relationship with money began to shift. I updated my budget, adjusting projections, watching the numbers move in a direction they hadn't in years. It wasn't instant wealth or sudden freedom, but it was movement, forward movement. I signed up for a cooking class on Thursday nights at a community center a few blocks from my apartment. It was an impulsive decision, the kind I rarely made. The room was filled with strangers of all ages and backgrounds, united only by a shared desire to learn something new. No one knew my family. No one measured me against anyone else. They only knew me as Maddie. We laughed when sauces burned and applauded when someone finally got their dough to rise properly. I found myself relaxing into conversations without the familiar edge of comparison. Here, I wasn't a shadow. I was simply present. At work, something shifted too. Without the constant undercurrent of resentment and exhaustion, I found it easier to focus. I took on more complex projects, volunteered for analyses that required deeper attention. I stayed late not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to see the work through. One evening, as I reviewed a particularly intricate report, my director stopped by my desk. He glanced at the screen, then at me. "You're good at this," he said simply. "We rely on you." The words landed softly, but they stayed with me long after he walked away. Recognition didn't always come with applause. Sometimes it came quietly, honestly, without conditions. On weekends, I started saying yes to invitations again. A hike near Mount Hood, coffee with a friend I hadn't seen in months. Small choices that reminded me how much I had narrowed my world without realizing it. Standing at the summit during one of those hikes, looking out over endless stretches of green forest, I felt a clarity settle in. The air was thin and cold, the sky wide and indifferent. In that moment, I wasn't someone's daughter or someone's sister. I was just me. The changes were subtle, but they accumulated quickly. My evenings grew calmer, my sleep deepened. The constant tension I had carried for years began to unwind, replaced by a cautious optimism I hadn't felt in a long time. Then, one afternoon, as I was organizing files at work, an email appeared in my inbox. The subject line caught my attention immediately. It was from a fintech startup based in Seattle. I stared at the screen, my heart beginning to race as I opened the message. They had seen my work through a professional network. They were expanding. They were looking for someone with my background, my experience. The role was demanding, the expectations high. The salary was more than 40% higher than what I was currently earning. I read the email twice, then a third time, just to be sure. For years, opportunities like this had felt out of reach, not because I lacked the skills, but because I had been anchored by obligations I never questioned. Now, for the first time, there was nothing pulling me back. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. Leaving Portland would mean leaving the city that had shaped my adult life. It would mean starting over in a place that didn't hold the weight of my family's expectations. It would mean choosing growth over familiarity. That evening, I called my closest friend and told her about the offer. "You have to take it," she said without hesitation. "This is what you've been working toward, whether you realized it or not." After we hung up, I sat alone in my apartment, the city lights flickering outside the window. My parents' voices echoed faintly in my memory. "You're not half the woman your sister is." I opened my laptop and typed a reply. "I accept." 4 words. Simple. Decisive. As I hit send, a sense of exhilaration surged through me, followed by a calm I hadn't expected. I wasn't running anymore. I was choosing, and for the first time, the future didn't feel like something I was postponing for someone else's sake. It felt like something I was finally allowed to claim. The weeks leading up to my move to Seattle passed in a blur of lists, deadlines, and quiet reflection. On the surface, my life looked busier than ever. I wrapped up projects at work, handed off responsibilities, and fielded polite questions from colleagues who were curious but careful, as if sensing that this change was more than just a new job. Underneath it all, something steadier was forming, a feeling I hadn't known how to name before. Resolve. I began walking through Portland differently, as if I were already saying goodbye without admitting it out loud. I lingered longer at the small cafe under the Burnside Bridge, watching steam rise from mugs and people hurry past the windows with their collars turned up against the chill. I took slower routes home from work, noticing details I had rushed past for years. The uneven bricks on the sidewalk, the way the river caught the light just before sunset. This city had been the backdrop for my quiet endurance. It had seen me carry responsibilities I never asked for and dreams I never allowed myself to fully claim. And now, it was watching me prepare to leave them behind. Packing was surprisingly easy. I realized how little I truly needed when I wasn't trying to maintain an image for anyone else. I sorted through my belongings with a clear sense of intention, keeping only what felt honest, what felt like it belonged to the version of me I was becoming. Old clothes went into donation bags. Papers were filed neatly or discarded. I came across the folder of bank statements once more and paused. I didn't throw it away. I placed it carefully into my carry-on bag, not as a weapon or a reminder of pain, but as proof of what I had survived. Proof that my strength wasn't theoretical. It was documented. Undeniable. The day I left Portland, I went for one last run along the river. The morning air was cool and clean, and my breath came easily this time. I ran without thinking, my body moving with a confidence it hadn't known when I first started. When I finally stopped, hands on my knees, heart pounding, I smiled. This wasn't escape. It was evolution. Seattle greeted me with gray skies and sharp wind, a different kind of energy from Portland's gentle dampness. The city felt taller, denser, more insistent. It demanded attention, focus, presence, and I welcomed that. My new job plunged me into a rhythm that was both exhausting and exhilarating. Long meetings, high expectations, conversations that moved quickly and assumed competence. No one here cared about my family background or my role in someone else's story. They cared about results, and I delivered. Without the constant drain on my finances or my emotions, I poured myself into my work. I stayed late, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to see my ideas take shape. I collaborated with people who challenged me, who questioned my assumptions, who respected my answers. For the first time in my career, I felt truly matched to my environment. Evenings in Seattle were quieter at first. My apartment was sparsely furnished, the walls bare, the rooms echoing slightly. But the quiet was different from before. It wasn't loneliness. It was space. Space to think, to breathe, to imagine what might come next. Then, about 6 months in, something remarkable happened. One night, sitting alone on the balcony, I opened my personal spreadsheet and updated my savings projections. I had been doing it routinely, out of habit more than expectation. But as the numbers recalculated, I froze. The total stared back at me, bold and unmistakable. I had enough for a down payment. My heart began to race, not with fear, but with disbelief. I ran the numbers again, checking for mistakes. There were none. Between my increased salary, the absence of monthly transfers, and a renewed discipline that came from purpose rather than pressure, I had crossed a threshold I once thought was years away. I laughed softly, the sound surprising in the stillness of the apartment. The very thing I had sacrificed for so long was now within reach. I contacted a real estate agent the next morning, my voice steady despite the excitement buzzing beneath it. Over the following weeks, we toured apartments across the city. Some were spacious but dim, their windows small and narrow. Others were bright but impractically located, too far from work, too disconnected from the pulse of the city. I wasn't in a rush. I had waited too long, endured too much, to settle for something that didn't feel right. Then one afternoon, we stepped into a newly built tower downtown. The elevator doors opened onto the 16th floor, and as I walked into the unit, I stopped short. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined the living room, revealing a sweeping view of Seattle. The Space Needle rose in the distance, sharp and unmistakable against the sky. Sunlight poured in, reflecting off polished wooden floors and illuminating every corner of the space. It wasn't large, just one bedroom, compact, efficient, but it felt like home. I stepped onto the balcony, the wind brushing against my face, the city alive below. In that moment, a certainty settled over me, quiet and absolute. This is mine, not borrowed, not conditional, not sustained by invisible sacrifice. Mine. As the agent spoke beside me, outlining next steps, timelines, paperwork, I barely heard her. I was too busy standing there, taking in the view, feeling something I had never allowed myself to feel before. Pride. Not the loud kind that demands attention, but the deep, steady kind that comes from knowing you built something with your own hands, on your own terms. I nodded and said yes. And with that decision, I crossed another line, one that separated the life I had endured from the life I was finally choosing to live. The day I signed the contract, my hands trembled just slightly as I held the pen. It wasn't fear that made them shake. It was the weight of understanding what this moment represented. Years of restraint, years of choosing others first, years of telling myself that later would come if I waited long enough. And now later was here, quietly unfolding across a polished desk in a real estate office overlooking the city. When I finished signing, the agent slid the keys toward me with a smile that felt ceremonial. The metal was cool against my palm, heavier than I expected. "Congratulations," she said. "You're a homeowner." The word echoed in my mind long after I left the office. That afternoon, I went straight to the apartment. The building's lobby smelled faintly of fresh paint and clean stone. The elevator ride to the 16th floor felt surreal, like I was floating between versions of myself. When the doors opened, I walked down the hall slowly, counting the steps without meaning to. When I reached the door, I paused. This was the first door I had ever opened that belonged entirely to me. Inside, the apartment was empty. No furniture, no boxes yet, just open space and light. I set my bag down near the entrance and walked into the living room, my footsteps echoing softly against the wooden floor. The city stretched out beyond the windows, the Space Needle standing firm in the distance. A quiet reminder that this view was no longer something I was borrowing. I stood there for a long time, letting the reality sink in. For the first time in my life, nothing here was conditional. No unspoken expectations, no invisible debts, no role to maintain. Everything was mine. Over the next few weeks, I began furnishing the apartment carefully. Intentionally, I chose a light gray sofa that felt inviting rather than impressive, a small oak dining table that fit perfectly by the window, a tall bookshelf that nearly brushed the ceiling, ready to hold my favorite books and a few plants. I promised myself I would actually keep alive. I hung a framed photograph of Portland on one wall, a quiet tribute to the city that had held me during some of my hardest years. It wasn't nostalgia, it was acknowledgement. Each choice felt like a declaration. In the evenings, I stood on the balcony and watched the city lights flicker on one by one. There was a stillness inside me I had never known before, a sense of completion that didn't rely on anyone else's approval. I slept better. I woke up with clarity. One night, moved by the view and the quiet satisfaction of the moment, I took a photo from the balcony, just a corner of the Space Needle glowing against a warm orange sunset. I posted it on my personal page with a simple caption, "A new beginning." I didn't expect much from it. A few likes, a congratulatory comment or two. It was simply a marker, a small flag planted in the ground of my own life. Minutes later, my phone buzzed. Claire. Her message was short. "You're really something. Why didn't you tell the family?" I stared at the screen, a familiar tension rising in my chest. The words sounded almost like praise. But underneath them, I sensed something else. Surprise. Perhaps even unease. As if my success had disrupted a story she was accustomed to telling herself. I began typing a reply, then stopped. What would I say? That I had learned to stop announcing my milestones. That I no longer needed their acknowledgement. That this home existed because I finally chose myself. I deleted the half-formed response and turned the phone face down on the table. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to explain. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. I poured myself a glass of wine, put on soft music, and settled onto the sofa. The apartment was still sparsely furnished, the corners echoing slightly, but it felt full in a way no space ever had before, full of intention, full of truth. I thought of the dinners where I had sat quietly, shrinking under comparison, the nights I had gone home carrying words that lingered like bruises. The version of myself who believed endurance was the same as strength. She had brought me here, and now she could rest. I didn't know then that my family was already rewriting the narrative. That somewhere, back in that suburban house, a new story was being constructed, one that erased me once again. I didn't know that the silence I had chosen would soon be challenged in a way I couldn't ignore. All I knew was that for the first time, I wasn't living in reaction to anyone else's expectations. I was living inside my own life. And that felt like the most radical thing I had ever done. The first hint came in the most ordinary way. On an afternoon that should have been unremarkable, I was standing in my kitchen, sleeves rolled up, rinsing vegetables for dinner when my phone rang. The name on the screen surprised me. Mrs. Jensen. She was an elderly woman who lived across the street from my parents back in Portland. Someone who had known our family for decades. Someone who still sent handwritten holiday cards and occasionally asked after me when she saw my parents outside. I wiped my hands on a towel and answered, "Maddie, dear," she said warmly, then hesitated, as if weighing her next words. "How have you been?" "I'm good," I replied. "I moved to Seattle recently." "Oh yes, your mother mentioned that," she said, though her tone suggested she knew very little about it. "Listen, I saw something today, and I wasn't sure if you already knew, but I felt strange not telling you." A faint unease settled in my chest. "What did you see?" I asked. "I was walking past your parents' house this morning," she continued, "and they've hung up a big banner, quite a large one. I thought it was interesting." Before I could respond, my phone chimed with a message. A photo arrived a second later. I stared at the screen, my breath catching as the image sharpened into focus. The familiar front porch, the pale siding, and stretched across the space above it, a wide white banner with bold red letters. "Congratulations, Claire, for preserving the family home." For a moment, I couldn't process what I was seeing. My mind rejected it instinctively, as if it were a mistake or a cruel misunderstanding. Preserving the family home. The words felt unreal, disconnected from the truth I carried so clearly in my body. Mrs. Jensen's voice filtered back in. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, she said gently, but I thought you should know. I thanked her and ended the call, my hands shaking as I lowered the phone. The apartment around me felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing in. The bright light from the windows no longer felt comforting. It felt exposed. They had done it. They hadn't just ignored my sacrifice. They had erased it. They had rewritten the story entirely, placing Claire at the center, crowning her as the savior. As if my 3 years of quiet transfers had never existed. As if I had never stepped in at all. I sank onto a chair, the image still glowing on my phone. My chest burned. A mix of shock, grief, and something sharper. Betrayal. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't carelessness. It was deliberate. In their version of events, I was no longer invisible. I was non-existent. Memories surged forward uninvited. The winter night phone call, my mother's trembling voice, the promise of just this once, the 36 transfers, the way my savings dwindled while the house remained untouched. And now, all of it had been handed to someone else as a badge of honor. I felt tears well up. Hot and sudden. They spilled over before I could stop them, blurring the screen, blurring the room. I let them fall, not out of weakness, but out of the sheer weight of realizing how easily a truth can be buried when it inconveniences the people telling the story. But as the tears slowed, something else took their place. Resolve. I straightened, wiping my face, my breathing evening out. I had spent too long swallowing injustice in the name of peace. I had stayed silent because I believed dignity meant endurance. But this wasn't dignity, it was erasure. They could hang a banner. They could congratulate Claire. They could tell neighbors and relatives whatever version of the story made them most comfortable. But I had evidence. I stood and walked to the cabinet where I had stored my important documents. Inside was the familiar folder, the one that had traveled with me to Seattle. I laid it out on the table, opening it slowly, deliberately. There they were, the bank statements. Each transfer clearly marked dates, amounts. A 3-year timeline no banner could erase. I opened my laptop and began organizing them, scanning each page carefully, naming the files with precision. Month, year, transfer amount. I added screenshots of messages from my mother, the ones that still lived on my phone. Maddie, if we don't pay this month, the bank will take the house. Just this once. I promise. Just this once. 36 times. As the documents came together, my emotions settled into focus. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about humiliating anyone. It was about reclaiming the truth. If they were determined to celebrate a lie, then I would bring the truth into the light. Calmly, clearly, without raising my voice. I compiled everything into a single, orderly report. The kind I would prepare for a client or a board meeting. Charts showing the monthly transfers, a running total. Notes attached to each entry, $72,000. The number stared back at me, no longer painful, but powerful. I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the Seattle skyline. The city lights shimmered in the distance, indifferent but steady. For the first time since seeing the banner, I felt grounded. They had chosen to erase me. I was choosing to be seen, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that I would not allow my story to be rewritten without my consent. The truth was documented, organized, ready, and soon. Whether they liked it or not, it would speak for itself. The invitation arrived 3 days later, slipped into my inbox with the polished language of celebration and gratitude. The subject line read, Family Appreciation Dinner, and the message beneath it was carefully worded, warm on the surface, rehearsed beneath. My parents were hosting a special evening in Seattle. It said, a chance for everyone to come together and honor the resilience of our family after difficult years. I read it twice, then a third time. Nowhere in the message did my name appear. Not as a contributor, not as a guest of honor, just another relative, loosely included, as if my presence were optional rather than essential. The timing was no coincidence. The banner, the whispers traveling through extended family, and now, a public celebration designed to seal the revised version of events into collective memory. They weren't just erasing me quietly anymore. They were replacing me. I forwarded the email to myself and closed my laptop, letting the room fall into silence. Outside, Seattle hummed with its usual rhythm, oblivious to the quiet storm gathering inside me. I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity, a steady, unshakable understanding that this was a line I could not allow to be crossed without consequence. That evening, my cousin Sarah called. "Maddie," she said hesitantly, "I wasn't sure whether to tell you, but I think you deserve to know. Mom asked me to help prepare the slideshow for the dinner." My fingers tightened around the phone. "What kind of slideshow?" There was a pause. Photos of the house. Claire standing on the porch. Captions about how she stepped up. About preserving the family home. I closed my eyes. I knew it. Sarah added quickly, "It feels wrong. I didn't know what to do." "You did the right thing by telling me," I said, my voice steady. "Can you send me the file?" She hesitated, then agreed. When the slideshow arrived, I opened it slowly. Slide after slide confirmed what I already knew. Carefully curated images, selective memory, words chosen not for truth, but for comfort. The final slide read in bold letters, "Thank you, Claire, for preserving our family home." I didn't delete anything. Instead, I made a copy. I kept every image, every caption. I wanted the beginning to look exactly as they intended. Normal, celebratory, safe. Then, after the final slide, I added my own. The first was simple, a timeline, 36 dates, each paired with an amount transferred. The next slide showed a bar chart, month by month, the line climbing steadily upward. Then screenshots of messages, my mother's words frozen in time. "If the bank doesn't receive the payment, we'll lose the house. Just this once, I promise." The final slide contained a single photograph. The house, taken from the street last summer. Beneath it, in plain text, were the words, "This was my contribution." I saved the file in 3 places: my laptop, a USB drive, and the cloud. I printed the full financial report and placed it neatly in a folder, the way I would before presenting to a board. I wasn't preparing for confrontation. I was preparing for accuracy. The night of the dinner, the restaurant in downtown Seattle glowed like a stage set for applause. Warm lights spilled through tall windows. Cars lined the street. Laughter drifted out as guests arrived in small groups, dressed as if for something important. I sat in my car for a moment before going in, the USB drive cool and solid in my palm. My heartbeat was steady, not rushed, not afraid. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. My father stood near the front, microphone in hand, wearing the confident smile I knew so well. My mother sat beside him, eyes bright, posture proud, and Claire, in an emerald dress, occupied the center of the room, radiant and composed. Applause broke out as my father began to speak. "We are so fortunate," he said, his voice carrying easily, "to have a daughter who stepped up when times were hard, someone who preserved the family home, who ensured our legacy remained intact." More applause. Glasses clinked. The slideshow began. Images of the house. Claire smiling on the porch. Words praising her strength and sacrifice. I stood near the back, unseen, waiting. Then the final slide faded. The screen went white. Black text appeared. "Financial contributions 2020-2023. A murmur rippled through the room. I stepped forward. My heels struck the floor with measured confidence as I crossed the space toward the front. Conversations fell silent. Forks paused midair. I stopped beneath the screen and turned to face the room. "If the truth embarrasses you," I said calmly, "that is not my fault." Behind me, the slides advanced. Dates, amounts, charts, messages. 36 transfers, $72,000. The room froze. I watched faces shift as recognition dawned. Whispers began to spread, soft at first, then louder. Someone gasped. Someone else shook their head. My father's face drained of color. My mother stared at the screen, lips trembling, hands clenched in her lap. Claire stood motionless, her expression collapsing as the narrative she had worn so comfortably dissolved around her. "This is the truth," I continued, my voice even. "This house did not stand because of one person's success. It stood because of quiet, consistent sacrifice." Silence followed. Then, slowly, applause began. Not thunderous, not celebratory, but deliberate, affirming. I didn't stay to hear what came next. I turned and walked out into the cool Seattle night, the city lights stretching ahead of me like an open road. I felt no triumph, no vengeance, only relief. 2 days later, there was a knock at my door. My parents stood there, smaller somehow, stripped of performance. My mother spoke first, her voice breaking. They wanted to add my name to the deed, to make things right. I listened, then I shook my head. "I don't need my name on that house," I said gently. "I have my own." What I needed, I realized, was not recognition on paper, but peace in my own life. As they left, I stood alone in my apartment, looking out at the city I had chosen, the home I had built. The past no longer had a hold on me. My value had never lived in comparison, or approval, or silence. It lived in the resilience I carried, the courage to speak, and the choice to step into my own light, and that was something no one could ever erase. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If this journey resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own strength, your own silent battles, or the moment you finally chose yourself, then this story was meant for you. Stories like this are shared here to remind us that reclaiming our voice is never selfish, and standing in our truth is never wrong. If you want to hear more powerful stories about resilience, justice, self-worth, and the courage to break free, don't forget to subscribe to the channel Vengeance Within. Your support helps us continue bringing stories that matter, stories that give strength, and stories that remind us who we really are. Until the next story, take care of yourself. And remember, your worth is never defined by anyone else.